Good afternoon, welcome. My name is William Interligator. I'm the music director and conductor of the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra, and I want to welcome you to this opportunity to visit with you about our concerts tomorrow at the Cheyenne Civic Center. I want to take a moment to thank our host, the Laramie County Library, which has been a wonderful partner with the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra for many years, and whose facility is really a gem of the Front Range area. As many of you recall, we started our season last month with an exploration of wonderful music for string orchestra, just the strings alone. And part of that was motivated by the social distancing that we need to do to perform on stage. So we can't have the entire Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra on stage with all of the different families of instruments. And this month we're exploring the woodwinds, brass, and percussion. So there will be no strings at all on the concert tomorrow. And it's a wonderful opportunity to give these families of instruments the spotlight and to explore the very rich repertoire written for them. You could say that perhaps I'm a little bit biased as a woodwind player myself, but I think that this program will have a lot in it for just about any kind of listener, whether you love brass or percussion or woodwinds or just orchestral music in general. We have everything for you on the program tomorrow. In fact, we have, over 400 years of music in terms of the time span, from the earliest piece, the Gabrielli Canzone, which I'll talk about in a minute, which was written in 1597, all the way up to a piece written in 2012 and revised in 2018 by an American composer, Alison Loggins Hull. The Copeland Fanfare for the Common Man, which is so popular and well known, will begin our program. And I really wanted to program this piece because during these trying times, these last many, many months, it's really kind of been on the shoulders of the common man for us to get through it. Everybody, we're all in this together. And that's really the intention behind this piece. When Copeland wrote it in 1942, as part of a commission project for the Cincinnati Symphony and their conductor, Eugene Goossens, Goossens had the idea that while America was still embroiled in the war, World War II, and things weren't going very well in 1942, he commissioned 18 living composers to write fanfares to begin each of the different concert programs of the Cincinnati Symphony that season. So there were 18 fanfares commissioned, actually, and Copeland's is perhaps, well, definitely the most famous of the 18, the one that's really had a life of its own. The Copeland Fanfare for the Common Man almost had a different title. Copeland was debating about a couple of different options. Fanfare for the Spirit of Democracy may have been its original title. Another one he considered was Fanfare for the Rebirth of Lidice, a Czech village recently sacked by the Nazis. I think he stumbled on a winner with Fanfare for the Common Man. It really does speak to the spirit of this whole country. And there's a wonderful quote from Aaron Copland. He said, it was the common man who was doing all the dirty work in the war and the army. He deserved a fanfare too. So this was kind of really par for the course for Copeland at that time. In the 1930s, when the Depression hit, Copeland completely changed his style of musical composition. From a kind of highbrow elite style that sometimes dabbled in jazz, a style influenced by his studies in France with Nadia Boulanger, he came back to this country after studying in France, and he was writing more modern music, more modernistic music, for perhaps an elite audience. But when the Depression hit, he decided to use his music to help lift people's spirits. It began a so-called populist, period in his composition, most famously represented by Appalachian Spring, Billy the Kid, and some of those other wonderful ballets from that time. So when he wrote this in 1942, that distinctively American sound that he developed in the 1930s to help inspire people during the Depression was already a very big part of his musical vocabulary. In fact, there's something about the open harmonies and open intervals in Appalachian Spring that he uses in a very different way in Fanfare for the Common Man, the stacked perfect fourths, if you're musically oriented. Here's a little bit of the opening of this wonderful fanfare, beginning, of course, with the sort of call to attention by the percussion section. And how poignant that would be during the time of war to hear that. Again, the sounds of war, of shots in the percussion. And then French horns join the trumpets. Can you imagine music more brave, more noble, more inspiring during a time of war? It's hard to imagine. Copland really outdid himself with this little gem. And this fanfare has had a life of its own, not just in the classical music world. It's been performed, countless times by orchestras, brass ensembles all over the world, but it also has had a life in popular culture as well. It's been used countless times in television for sporting events, for elections. It was used, of course, as, it was sort of revised by Emerson, Lake and Palmer in a very famous version. Even the Rolling Stones used that music to come on stage during one of their tours. This music, in the words of our wonderful program note annotator, Dr. William Runyon, is a national treasure. And I love the way Bill Runyon said it. He said, "This piece has become a defining icon of America's self-perception. We hear this music and we think, that's what we want to strive to be. That's who we are. That's America." There's something about the spirit of that. Those three lonely trumpets playing together, isolated and alone and exposed out there, so brave. Playing high, soaring high in a very challenging way. You can hear, in a sense, that there's a sense of struggle in the music, but that there's a sense of triumph and nobility as well. So excited to perform this now when it might have even more meaning for every common man in our country. One of the aspects of this program that is kind of interesting is that performing a piece like Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man is taxing on our musicians, on those brass and percussion players. It's helpful to give them a break. And so one of the ways we're doing that is alternating some pieces that focus on the brass and some pieces that focus on the woodwinds. So the next piece on the program is a piece very different. It's a Mendelssohn Nocturne written for winds. And it's not his most famous nocturne. It's not the nocturne from A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is very famous. This is a nocturne that he wrote in 1824 at the age of 15. Shocking. And it's a masterpiece of wind writing. Now it has the woodwinds, and it does also have two French horns, a trumpet, and a tuba. The tuba is taking the place of an obsolete instrument that Mendelssohn wrote it for, because he wrote it for a specific group of wind players in Bad Doberan in Germany, where he and his family were on vacation. They were on vacation in this resort, and there was an established group of wind players playing sort of like the village band. And he heard them play, and he wrote this beautiful piece for them. It had an instrument that, even for Mendelssohn, it was unusual. Later, he wrote about it to his sister, drew a little picture of it too, said, "This is what it looks like, I can't believe it." It was called an English bass horn, and it was primarily made up of wood, but it did have a metal bell, and it had a strange cupped mouthpiece, so it must have sounded a little unusual. That instrument really no longer exists. So when we perform this music, there's always a question about what part will cover that. And for our performances with the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra, it's a tuba. A small tuba is a sort of an equivalent instrument. Now, one of the reasons I chose this piece to feature on this program is that after discovering it just a few years ago, I fell in love with the introduction of it. I thought that it was literally some of the most beautiful wind writing ever written. And here it was written by a young Mendelssohn at age 15. It's well known that Mendelssohn, found his mature musical voice by age 16, 17. I would argue that maybe even in this piece, it's coming through. Now, the piece, the Nocturne, is sort of like an outdoor serenade music. It starts slowly with a beautiful introduction, as I was talking about, and then it gives way to a very rambunctious fast section. I'll play you parts of it in just a moment. The fast section is very much inspired by the music of Carl Maria von Weber, who had a wonderful way of writing, especially for wind instruments and especially for the clarinets. And in this piece, the clarinets get featured quite a bit with unbelievable virtuosic scales and patterns, and it sounds very much like Mendelssohn's homage to Weber. But before we get that, we have this beautiful introduction I was telling you about. Listen to how the French horns and bassoons set the stage for a beautiful clarinet melody. Sound. A simple melody is repeated with the full group with a beautiful lone flute on top. Remember, this is the period of early German Romanticism, and there's so much heart in the music. The instruments are literally singing. It's a song. And this part I just adore. The French horn takes over the melody. That's quite amazing French horn writing for 1824. As I was saying before, the music has heart in it, and it's sort of born out of the tradition in a sense of like Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words and the German Lied tradition that he was surely aware of with Schubert, although a lot of Schubert's music, may not have had general popularity and was well known. There's just something about this music that also just, it sort of speaks of that era of early German Romanticism, like a painting of Caspar David Friedrich. As we move into the faster section, I'm going to go ahead here. This is just a YouTube recording that I found. You'll hear that sort of Weber, Carl Maria von Weber, like if you're familiar with his music, use of the clarinet in a sort of ecstatic style. Perhaps not the greatest recording here. Like as I said, this is just on YouTube. It's a wonderful piece that is sort of a symphonic movement unto itself, with its own, in the fast section, its own exposition, development, recapitulation, and some wonderfully just poignant dissonances that come in at one point in the development section that make me think Mendelssohn had already been studying some Mozart slow movements from some of his concertos and other things like that, that it's just poignantly just beautiful, where like an oboe will hold an A flat, and then you'll hear another instrument come in on an A natural, and then it resolves, and just musically delicious. So this Mendelssohn piece, like a lot of Mendelssohn pieces, was revised later on in his life. He came back to this music and he said, you know, I wrote something as a teenager that could have another life. And so years later, he added many more instruments, and he added drums and other things like that, and it became known as his Overture for Winds. You might be familiar with it in that title, but even as that, in that title and in that form, it's still not performed as often as it should be. And so I'm really excited to have a piece of music that you probably have never heard, but you will love. Following the Mendelssohn, we're going to shift gears back to the brass to perform Gabrielli's Canzone Settimi Toni, number 2. Gabrielli was very busy in Venice, Italy. And this was a period of the sort of high Renaissance in Venice. And if you've ever been to Venice, you know you have to see San Marco's, the piazza there, the square. And then if you can wait in line long enough, it's a very long line, you can get into the actual cathedral in San Marcos. If you do, or if you've been there, you might recall that there are wonderful balconies. And Gabrielli, like his father before him and many other composers of that era, decided to use those balconies of the church to create beautiful musical stereo. Long before we developed stereo for hi-fis and things like that, Gabrielli was doing this in the 1500s. So we'd have groups of musicians placed in different portions of the balcony with their music playing and bouncing off of each other, sometimes call and response, sometimes all together. It was a wonderful effect, and I'm sure very powerful and moving hearing it in that actual beautiful Byzantine church. So Gabrielli's music was, he wrote a lot of different things for brass instruments, unusual instruments also, like the Mendelssohn. This piece would have been written for trombones and something called a cornetto, which would have been sort of played like a recorder, a wooden instrument, but it had a mouthpiece like a brass instrument. And now those parts are played by modern trumpets. Any brass player today will tell you that one of their favorite composers for brass is Gabrielli. And it's pieces like this that come to mind. There's just something so rewarding about hearing these pieces for brass with these different choirs bouncing off of each other. Now, in a non-COVID year, the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra performing this piece would have taken advantage of the different choirs and maybe placed one group of musicians in the balcony, or maybe each group of musicians would be on opposite sides of the stage. But given our regulations and safety concerns around COVID, the musicians on stage can't change where they are on stage. So we are able to have them stand for this one, except for the tubas. But that helps. But the choirs are kind of intermingled amongst each other, which actually makes it even more difficult to play for the players, because their own like little team is interspersed with the opposing team of players that is bouncing off of them. In any case, you're going to love the wonderful effect that's created by this music. Here's the opening of Gabrielli's Canzone Settimi Toni. The title, by the way, refers to the key signature or type of mode or scale, which is the 7th tone scale or Mixolydian scale. It's glorious music, my goodness. And at times, like you heard, the groups, even though they're separated by choirs, they play strong and forcefully together, and sometimes bouncing off of each other. But then there are many times where all of a sudden there's an incredibly rich counterpoint, and it's suddenly like you're being washed over by these different voices in counterpoint amongst themselves. And it's almost like you feel a little lost with that kind of counterpoint, and then suddenly there's that magical moment where they come back together on a cadence, on one beautiful B-flat chord, or F chord, or E-flat chord. And then it moves on again. One of the distinctive characteristics about this Gabriele canzone is that the music really doesn't repeat until one moment just before the end, and the whole piece is only about 3 minutes, but one moment just before the end where the very opening comes back, as if to signal, okay, here's the beginning of the ending, we're about to come to a conclusion here. But it's unusual, considering the musical styles that we're used to from the classical, even Baroque era, classical era, Romantic, 20th century, where musical repetition serves as a really important way to create musical form and structure. You know, we hear or repeat, it helps let us locate where we are in the music. And then we hear something new, and then we come back to something that we heard before. It helps ground us. In Gabriele's time, in the Renaissance, this was not the custom so much. And it really also reflected their worldview at the time. I mean, the Enlightenment really brought a newfound idea that even though things change, things will come back and stay the same. And that type of philosophy is perhaps reflected in the music of early classical music. But this is a whole other time period. This is 1597. Renaissance time, and yes, some Enlightenment ideals were certainly being talked about by philosophers and artists, but it hadn't yet maybe reached music. Sometimes the philosophies of the time reached musical circles a little later. In this Gabriele piece, it just continues to go on, go on, go on, and then finally it does give us a little nod to say, you're back home. But that's very much sort of the style of how it was back then. Maybe I'll play a little bit of the ending of the piece. Let's see if I can get to that. 1 second. Okay. I might go on. Yeah, wait a second. Here it is. Okay. I'm going to play a little bit of the ending, like I said. 1 second. I'm still figuring out all the technology here. Okay, it's playing. That's the beginning again. Sorry. Those of you who have been coming to these lectures for over 10 years know that I am technologically challenged, and I'm keeping up that tradition today. Okay, well, you'll have to hear it in the concert to hear how that yum dum 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 dum, that kind of festive celebratory opening comes back shortly before the very end. Doesn't it almost sound like music for the holidays? Like a brass band playing a Christmas-style music outdoors. Well, yeah, you could think of it that way. Holidays are right around the corner. The next piece of music we're going to perform is by the French composer Charles Gounod. Gounod was mostly known for his operas, Faust, Romeo and Juliet. In fact, the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra performed several pieces of his when we did our special Romeo and Juliet project a year or two ago with Sarah Hartman and others, where we had some opera, some ballet, some theater, and some orchestral concert. Now, a lot of the opera that you heard that evening was Gounod's Romeo and Juliet. He was a master of operatic writing, creating the right mood, subtle details of articulation to reflect in poignant aspects of the text. He was a master of that, and I have great respect for his operatic writing. What's also interesting is that after all the success of his operas, late in his life, he accepted an unusual invitation for a commission by a French flute player to write a piece for just winds, a little symphony, and that's what he called it, Little Symphony, Petite Symphonie. And this is Gounod's Petite Symphonie, and it's little in two respects. It's little because it's short. It's a 4-movement symphony that takes less than about 20 minutes. At the time that it was written in the 1880s, You might imagine that symphonies had grown to gargantuan lengths by then. One thinks of, Bruckner or things like that. The 1880s. So this is, let's see, this piece was written in 1885. Gounod would have been about 67 years old at that time. To put it in context, the young Richard Strauss was writing Don Juan right around that time in his 20s. Interesting. Okay, so not only is it petite in that it's short, but it's also petite in that it has no strings. It's just one flute, and then 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, and 2 French horns. Now let me digress for a moment and talk about French horns. French horns are an incredible instrument, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that maybe among one of your favorite instruments in the orchestra. They have so much incredible parts in orchestral music, noble, heroic music. Now, what is a French horn doing in a piece for woodwinds? Why are the French horns featured so much in this Gounod, as they were in the Mendelssohn piece, also on this program? And you may also remember that in a genre called the wind quintet, or woodwind quintet, there's also a French horn. French horns are brass instruments, aren't they? Well, the French horns get to lead this double life. They get to be one of the most powerful brass instruments, but they also get to be a woodwind. They're sort of a double agent, if you will. They're the invited, mole in the woodwind family. They get to join the woodwinds a lot. And that's one of the great, I think, pleasures and challenges as a French horn player. I can't speak to that as myself. I'm an oboist at heart. But French horn players, they get to be a woodwind sometimes, and they get to be a brass sometimes else. So that explains a little bit about why the French horns are part of this petit symphony in this little company of woodwinds. The French flute player, I wrote his name down. I learned it from our, again, wonderful program note annotator, Bill Rennion. Paul Toffanel. Paul Toffanel was a wonderful French flutist who, I guess he was renowned for his flute playing. He played in many orchestras, and he started the Society of Chamber Music for Winds in Paris. And he invited Gounod to write a piece for that group. Normally, the group that would have been written for didn't include the flute, but because the invitation came from this flute player, he added a flute to the otherwise sort of normal group of just pairs of oboes, bassoons, clarinets, and French horns. Actually, he gave the flute probably the best part. In the slow movement, there's an incredibly beautiful extended flute solo. This is also distinctive because it's Gounod writing in a sort of neoclassical style. We've had so many composers who, as a challenger, just for fun, decided to write in a style from a bygone era. One thinks of the Grieg Holberg suite on our previous concert last month with the strings, where Grieg, writing in the 1800s, was writing a sort of neo-Baroque piece as if it was from the 1600s. One thinks of Stravinsky's famous Pulcinella ballet, another great example of neoclassicism, this case in the 20th century. Now, with Gounod, he was writing in 1885. It definitely wasn't very popular at that time to write a neoclassical piece, but that's what he did. Beautifully proportioned with a classical sense of melody and a light accompaniment and a classical sense of form, the 4 movements of a short symphony, very much like a Haydn symphony. This piece is definitely sort of a nod to a bygone era. And I'm going to attempt to play some of it. As I said, it has 4 short movements. Here's the first movement. Like a Haydn symphony or some Mozart symphonies, some Beethoven, it starts with a slow introduction. Sort of mysterious, setting the stage like, something's coming, but I don't know what it is. We're going to jump ahead and you'll hear the lovely little allegretto. That's the main portion of this movement. It's so light and fun. I mean, the music has a big smile on its face. It's no wonder that woodwind players and horn players love this piece. The second movement is the slow movement that has the beautiful flute solo that I was telling you about. Comes in after a little introduction. Here's the flute solo. This is a great romantic opera composer in a funny, joke way, writing an opera slow movement from a bygone era. Like what he would imagine a Mozart slow aria would be like. Beautiful. And the way he sometimes uses the clarinets underneath the flute in a sort of hurdy-gurdy, like, it's gorgeous. It's beautiful music. And it's important to remember that it wouldn't have been his natural style. And as a 67-year-old composer who'd reached great fame and heights of grand romantic French opera, this is him as a sort of fun diversion, writing something in a lighter style. The third movement is a scherzo, which sounds kind of ominous at first, but then gives way to quite a lot of fun. And the middle section actually evokes the bagpipe drone of a musette, like we talked about last month with the Grieg-Holberg suite. You know, Scottish culture and history was so fascinating in Europe and on the continent, especially in the 1800s. They just were fascinated with the history, the folklore, the music, and it was very exotic still at that time. And so Gounod got wrapped up in this a little bit, and he gave us, in the middle section of this third movement, something that sounds kind of like bagpipes or an Irish drig over a drone, let's call it that. Okay, here's the opening of the movement. This is not the Scottish part or Irish part. It sounds more German than French, doesn't it? Again, I think Gounod was having fun with it. I'm going to jump ahead to that part that sounds to me as if it's kind of homage to some kind of Scottish culture. One second. And now that I'm hearing it again, it does sound more Irish than Scottish. But it has that sustained bass underneath it, like a bagpipe drone. That's what made me think of such a great little piece. And I'm sure that many of our regular concert goers have maybe never heard it before. The fourth movement is a lovely little piece that sort of ends it with a sort of twinkle in the eye. It doesn't end in a bombastic way because after all, this is a petit symphonie. It's very small in number, small in size. And here's just a little bit of that to give you a little taste of the finale of the Gounod. Short little introduction here. After that introduction, you'd almost expect something bigger and grander, instead of just one oboe and two bassoons. Lovely. You're really going to enjoy the Gounod Petit Symphony. That and the next piece on the program are kind of the heart and the meat of the program, if you will, kind of in the middle. The next piece is a ballet suite from Gustav Holst's opera, The Perfect Fool. Now we all are very aware of Gustav Holst as a composer because of his most famous piece, The Planets. Such an incredible piece. But did you know that Gustav Holst wrote 11 operas, many of which are not performed these days, one of which was called The Perfect Fool, an unusual title. And it turned out the libretto for this opera was about as flawed as the title of the opera itself. It was sort of a flaw. But the very opening of the opera, with a wizard starting an incantation and bringing up the spirit of the elements of earth, water, and fire, is something that's sometimes performed in concert halls as a separate piece, ballet music from The Perfect Fool. It's in its orchestral version. You can sometimes hear it done on concert halls. There's a wonderful recording on YouTube from the BBC, from the proms. But there's also such a great focus on brass instruments in this piece, even in the orchestral version, that some brass players have said, we're going to transcribe that for a large brass ensemble and percussion. And one of the greater, there are many adaptations like that. One of them was done by the Chicago Symphony's principal trombonist, Jay Friedman. That's the version we're doing. And so we have a very large brass ensemble. No woodwinds, just brass, but then there's also timpani and percussion as well. And creating that spirit of earth, water, and fire, you can just imagine the fun that the composer and later the arranger had in evoking those with these powerful instruments. Like, for instance, the spirit of earth is evoked with this melody way down low, subterranean, underground in the tuba. It's fantastic. The wizard who invokes these spirits is represented by the trombone, which, by the way, was Gustav Holst's own instrument. That was what he played. In fact, before he was focusing on his teaching career at the St. Paul's Girls' School, where he spent a lot of time in his professional career, he was a trombone player in professional orchestras prior to that. By the way, one of the great things about Holst is that he didn't want to get pigeonholed in one style of writing, and he had all these different fascinations, hobbies, and interests. He was a great devotee of mystical writings, Hindu religion, reading Sanskrit in the original. He was interested in astrology. He was interested in all these different kinds of things. And maybe in some ways that's reflected in the fact that his music is distinctive and unique and just sort of hard to pigeonhole. The Perfect Fool, I'm going to have to play you a little bit of the orchestral version, but it starts the same as the version you're going to hear with the Cheyenne Symphony, with the wizard represented by powerful trombones. Okay, let's see if I can find the right part here. Parts of this that sound a lot like The Planets, where he has juxtaposed C major and F sharp major, things going on like that he uses a lot. trombones are literally casting a spell, evoking words to bring forth the spirit of the earth. You can start hearing it bubble up. And then, as I said before, very low down in the tubas, you might not even be able to hear it in this recording, a melody appears. Earth itself, the spirit of earth. And this is turned up very loud, but boom, 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 boom. That's what you're supposed to be hearing. Let me see, maybe, 1 second. I think I know what the problem is. It's a different track. No, sorry, that's fire. That's water. I'm so sorry, my technological shortcomings. This is it. One of the neat things about this earth section is that the meter is sort of off kilter. It's not like us, but there are 2 feet. It's just the earth itself. It's in a 7/8 meter, and so it's a little off kilter. It's more and more powerful. And eventually that gives way to the spirit of water, which in this ballet is almost like its Venus movement. It's all about love and sensuality. And he uses a sort of pentatonic Asian sounding scale, and it makes it evoke sort of a gamelan effect. Let's see if I can find the right part here. This is it. Much smoother, liquid-like. Now, at our concert, this will be played by brass instruments. This is the original orchestra version. It almost sounds like some of Ravel's Witty music, right? Or some of Debussy's gamelan-inspired music. Yes. It's gorgeous. Very fluid and meditative. You can kind of sense that spiritual quality to it too. That gives way to something very rambunctious, the spirit of fire, so aptly portrayed in the brass. And even in the orchestral version, you can hear the brass is featured quite a bit. Let's see if this is it. No, that wasn't it. This is it. I'm not. Musical depictions of flames are kind of famous. There are many examples. Usually it has to do with lots of fast notes depicting those tops of the fire. One thinks of Wagner's famous magic fire music from the Ring. This is the part where the brass and percussion will literally raise raise the roof of the Civic Center tomorrow. So excited. Oh, I stopped it by accident. Oh, I'm sorry. No, you'll have to hear it tomorrow. Oh, it's exciting, that fire section. Then, after that, something completely different. A work by a young American composer named Allison Loggins Hall. She's currently based in New Jersey. She's on the faculty, I think is it Malk? I can't remember the name of the university she teaches at. She was teaching also at Juilliard. She describes herself as a flutist, composer, and producer. And she is really all of those things. She's had a very varied musical career already, even though she's so young. I'm guessing she's in her 30s. And she started a duo called Flutetronics with another flute player, and together they wrote a lot of great music for flute. One piece that they wrote was called Hammers. Inspired by the construction noises outside of her Brooklyn, New York window where she lived, she wrote this piece for flute and percussion that we're going to perform tomorrow. And it's great to feature our wonderful flutist, Ismael Reyes, along with 3 of our percussionists, in this great piece that sort of describes a sort of musical competition in a sense. It's a construction site outside of a flute player's apartment. And at one point you hear the flute player sort of playing on her own, and this noise from outside the window gets so annoying that then she starts joining them and beating them at their own game. And she's like, well, I too can play at that. And so that's why I say it's a little competitive at times. And they join forces, and sometimes they're opposed. And it's a lovely little, just short, I don't know, a couple minute piece with a kind of ABA form to it. And it's just a lot of fun. Yeah, I'm really glad to do this too, because not only does it bring our program into the 21st century, it also represents another American composer like Copeland, but it also represents a female composer, a woman composer, and it represents an African-American composer. Allison is African-American. So we're excited to feature her music, and I'm looking forward to featuring more of her music in the future as well. This is one that I wasn't able to come up with a good recording of. Is that right? Let me just check something here. Yeah, this is one where I wasn't able to get a recording of it, but if you're curious, after the lecture, just YouTube Hammers by Allison Loggins Hall. Actually, there are 2 versions of it. The original version, which we're performing, is from 2012 for flute and 3 percussionists. And then later in 2018, she did a version for flute and 4 percussionists, adding some wonderful bends of a timpani drum, playing a note and then bending the pitch, which added even more cacophony to the musical cacophony to the construction site. So, so after that piece, we finally get all of the musicians together for the final piece of the program. We go from the smallest personnel with the Hammers piece for 4 players to Handel's Music for the Royal Fireworks. We're going to perform the overture to this incredible piece from 1749. Handel wrote this piece to celebrate the end of the war, the Austrian War of Secession. And it's interesting that as bookends of the concert, we have Copeland's fanfare that he wrote to help get the country through the difficulties of World War II. That starts the concert, and what ends the concert is a celebration after a war is ended. How appropriate. When this war ended and the famous Treaty of La Chapelle was signed, it was after about 10 years of war, so there was quite a lot of cause for celebration. And in London's Green Park, they created a huge pavilion made just for this occasion by some Italian carpenters. A huge stage, almost like they were building, like the way they build things for the World's Fairs later on, sort of temporary city. And that's kind of what happened here. This giant park, Green Park in London, in the I guess it was exactly 1740, I want to say 1749. Yeah, 1749. And by the king's order, King George II, he said, let there be music to celebrate with the royal fireworks, but let there be no strings, only warlike instruments like drums, and trumpets, and wind instruments. Haydn obliged to him, but he couldn't resist coming up with a version later on for strings. But how appropriate for a concert without strings that we're going to get to do it in a somewhat more authentic original version. with just those bombastic warlike instruments, lots of trumpets, horns, trombones, tubas, and all the woodwinds as well, joined by timpani drums. And the timpani drum playing in a sort of Baroque style with harder mallets and a very hard-edged kind of sound to it. Now this is one of Handel's maybe one of his most famous pieces. I mean, not nearly as famous as Messiah, but along with water music, the Fireworks is sort of in a close second place after Messiah. The Fireworks has a number of different movements. We're just performing the overture for tomorrow's concert, and it starts with very regal sounding music. And I wanted to take this moment to just remind us that, isn't it interesting and fascinating that a German composer, Handel, who had studied in Italy and then moved to Great Britain and composed for, various kings and stuff, this German composer basically invented the sound that we associate with the English monarchy. That royal, regal sound that we associate with England actually came from a German. And let's not forget, King George II, for whom he wrote this music, was actually born in Germany and ruled in Germany before he became King of England. So there is that strong connection back then. And even later on, with some of the marriages too, as you know, from watching some of the great, from just some of the great stories with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and so forth, there's a very strong German connection. But it's so interesting. So this is just so quintessentially that English-sounding regal music. Here's a little bit of the opening. Hearing it now makes me think that, in a way very similar to Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man, this is music that inspires us to be better than ourselves. It inspires us to take a deep breath, be brave, and it sort of has this nobility about it. It's so wonderful. Like the Gabrielli, he uses call and response effects. Different choirs of instruments bouncing off of each other. It's said that he thought because it was going to be outdoors, he couldn't use a lot of carefully, deep or complex counterpoint that would get muddled in the outdoors. So he uses that call and response, very much like Gabrielli. In a moment here, we're going to move on to the main, faster section of this overture, the Allegro, which is a spirited kind of tempo that almost feels like it's trying to dance. A little cadenza for the solo piccolo trumpet. And this connects the introduction to the main fast section. And this part right about now, you're thinking, this doesn't sound that familiar to me. But just wait. You're going to hear something that everybody knows here in a minute. performed in 1749. And at the original performance, there were 100 cannons. They had 12 bassoons, 24 oboes, 9 trumpets at least, 9 horns at least, many sets of drums. And actually, many people wonder about, were the fireworks being shot out during the music? No, the music actually came before. But actually, even before that, there was a dress rehearsal the day before where over 12,000 people paid a small amount of money to Handel to watch the dress rehearsal. Handel was a good businessman. He had some smarts about him at that. So that was for the day before. Now, when the night happened, the big celebration happened, there's thousands and thousands of people there to see the fireworks, to hear the music. Unfortunately, there was something that went astray, and maybe it was a firework or something else flammable, but that newly constructed pavilion and stage that those Italians made, unfortunately caught fire. And the whole thing went up in flames. Several people were injured, and apparently a woman's clothes caught fire and everything like that. So unfortunately, this is a piece of regal music that was perhaps born in its first performance, or there was a kind of a crazy mishap event. But for our purposes, it's a wonderful way to end this concert with all of the woodwinds, brass percussion featured together in a very sort of noble, heroic style that ends our concert tomorrow at the Civic Center. Now, as a reminder, the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra will be masked when possible and socially distanced, as will our audiences. Instead of the normal 1,500 seats available to sell at the Civic Center, we have less than 300, I think. But I still want to encourage those of you who feel comfortable with it and who are healthy and able to do so to join us at the hall. We have 2 performances, 2 o'clock and 7:30. Both performances will be performed without an intermission, and it'll be just about an hour and 20 minutes long. And the audience will be asked to wear masks throughout. It will be, we have your safety in mind. For those of you choosing to watch us on the live stream, it's only for the evening concert from 7:30. And for those of you who are maybe tuning in today from other time zones in other parts of the country or the world, don't forget we're talking about mountain time. It's been a pleasure talking to you about this music I love so much and I'm so passionate about, and I'm so excited for you to hear it performed by the wonderful musicians in the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. Before we go, I'd like to invite Elizabeth Thorson from the Laramie County Library to come up and tell you a little bit more about some of the events going on here at the library. Thank you all so much, and I look forward to seeing you at the concert. Elizabeth.
There you go.
Thank you very much. That was William Ventrilogator, the music director and conductor of the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. As he said, there are 2 performances tomorrow. There are tickets still available. You can purchase those tickets at CheyenneSymphony.org. The library has at least one event coming up for adults in December. We're working on a couple more. The event that we're planning right now is on December 2nd. It's a continuation, or the finale, so to speak, of the One Book Wyoming program that we started last year. Dr. Caskey Russell from the University of Wyoming will be leading a book discussion of Hemingway's In Our Time. That information will be posted on the library website in a few days. You can go to the library's event calendar at our website, lclsonline.org or LaramieCountyLibrary.org to register for that event. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Bye-bye.